Cool. Good afternoon, everybody. We've still got a bunch of people trickling in, flooding in. So I'll just give it about 30 seconds and I'll get straight into things because we've got a lot to cover. In fact, I'll just start straight away because the preamble's all pretty boring and you've probably heard it before anyway. So thanks everybody for joining today. We are stretching my sort of portfolio of luck and lucky metaphors to their limit. Talking again about the forestry ETS registration LUC restrictions, which have now become law. They went through royal assent a week or so ago. And the big question now is really what are the implications going to be for landholders who are looking to register forest into the ETS, and how do they, to reference my title, make their own luck? So usual story, this webinar's recorded. It'll be shared on our website after the session. We've muted your microphone and video. Use the Q&A function at the bottom bar to ask your questions live. I probably won't see them as I'm talking, but I will look at them at the end of the session. We'll get into Q&A. If we don't get to your question, then we'll try and post an answer with the transcript on our blog. Nick Butcher, I'm the CEO. Probably the same big warning that I shared the last time for this one. Please don't come away from this session feeling like you've got the solution for your particular situation and that it's now all solved. This is a really complicated topic. We are still getting to grips with part of it. And I think this is more a guide to know where you should look more closely rather than to just not worry about something anymore. So it's an incomplete summary of our interpretation and opinion of what is no longer a draft bill, but now a bill that has passed into law. So this is binding as of I think the date, what do they call it? The commencement date is the 31st of October. And it's a very complicated topic. So do your own research, talk to an expert around your specific circumstances, especially before you make any investment decisions around this, and that includes buying or selling or transferring ownership of land. So for the focus today, there's a whole bunch of stuff which is going to seem a little bit like I'm assuming too much background knowledge if this is the first session that you've joined. If you do feel like I've whipped through certain sections too quickly, please go back and look on our website and find the last webinar on this topic where we sort of went into a lot more detail. Today, I'm trying to focus on the changes that have occurred to the legislation versus the first reading, which we've covered previously, and getting into the details on some of the planning implications for people who are now looking to have to operate under the new legislation. The high-level view remains the same. Essentially, there is a ban on ETS registration of forest on LUC 1 to 6 land, but it's not all forest, and it's not all 1 to 6 land. There is restricted forest is a particular thing, and for that restricted forest, there are exemptions which apply under which you can register restricted forest, and a lot of the complexity is around which bits of land fall into which LUC category, and are they restricted or not, and how might you use the exemptions. These are a direct copy from the previous presentation. I'm repeating them because they're extremely important. These restrictions are on ETS registration, not on planting. It is possible to legally plant a forest without necessarily hitting any red flags and then find out that you're unable to register it, which is going to be probably extremely bad for your investment case. So check that first. Similarly, this only covers the ETS registration restrictions. There are many other constraints and considerations around forest establishment, and you need to think about those before you plant, in addition to any existing and new ETS restrictions. So I'm presenting this again. Nothing really has changed here in our view in terms of the consideration, so I'm not going to step through it point by point. But as we discussed last time, in our view, you almost always probably will at least care about ETS registration. It may be that you're prepared to sacrifice the returns for some other reason, but usually the answer to the question, do you care about ETS registration, is yes for exotic forest, given the commercial implications. So the two questions you have to answer for your forest are, is it going to be restricted? And if it is, then will I have an exemption? And if the answers are yes and no, respectively, you might want to think very carefully about at least the business case for putting that forest where you're proposing to put it. Again, I'm not going to step through every single point because we touched on many of them last time, but basically restricted forest only occurs on LUC 1 to 6 land. LUC 7 to 8 land is not restricted under this legislation. You can do whatever you were able to do prior to the introduction of this legislation. However, there are many areas of LUC 1 to 6 land which are not restricted forest. Key ones, which I will just repeat, are if you're wondering about the situation for the forest that you put in 2 months ago before you realized that this legislation was going to take effect and you're going to panic and you're in a panic, don't panic. forest land that is forest land, which means established as forest prior to the 31st of October 2025 this year, is exempt. It's not, sorry, I shouldn't say exempt. I'm trying to make a distinction between exempt and restricted because they're different things. It's unrestricted. So the key thing is to make sure that you have evidence that it definitely was in forest as of the 31st of October, and then you should be able to register it with without having to go through the restricted approval pathway. Similar, forest species historically and into the future that are not predominantly exotic, so this essentially means indigenous forest, they are not restricted. There are a bunch of different classes of exempt Māori land. I won't enumerate those exhaustively, but view the Act. Erosion-prone land, which has a technical definition which we aren't entirely clear on what that actually is in a practical sense, region by region yet, but it is unrestricted. And I'll just briefly touch on that, though we will take a look later on. The wording in the legislation, I think, is any land that is mapped as having an erosion risk of high or severe in the regional or district level maps, it is unrestricted. What we're trying to find out is what those maps are, whether they're final, and basically make them available for planning purposes. Unmapped land, which is the majority of land is mapped, but unmapped land is basically land that doesn't have an LUC designation. Unfarmed land, which there is a specific definition of in the legislation. Don't just assume that because you think your land isn't farmed, then it qualifies for this criteria. The reason I've flagged it as pink is that the definition has changed slightly since the first draft of the legislation, but not in a material way from my perspective. Basically, unfarmed is land that has not been used for any farming purpose, including a laundry list of different things that qualify as farming, in the last 5 years, and has not had exotic forest established on it in the last 5 years prior to registration. So if you think you're going to use that pathway, you've got to make sure, be very sure that that applies to you. Also note that it applies at a title by title level. So there's actually a question about this that came in, which I'll get to later on, but this is unfarmed land is very much one where don't just assume that because you weren't farming that paddock, then it's got an exemption. Offsetting land has had a adjustment to basically avoid a loophole around P89 offsetting land. So offsetting land is exempt or is unrestricted, but only pre-1990 offsetting land. And then Crown afforestation land, which has a couple of definitions and exemptions, is also unrestricted. The remainder, which is probably most land actually in the LUC 1-6 category, will be restricted forest. And the exemptions, as before, there's transitional exemptions. There's an exemption for applications received prior to 31st of October, as well as for forest that's established prior to 31st of October. In general, they should be the same thing, but that's not entirely true necessarily in practice. There is an exemption for the 25% allowance, which we will cover in quite a bit of detail today around what that means. But essentially, it's up to 25% of the LUC 1-6 land per individual farm, where the individual farm has a definition which I went through in detail in the last session, so I won't repeat myself today. And then there's also a permitting approval process through a ballot mechanism for up to, by default, 15,000 hectares per year on LUC 6 land, where you can apply for an allocation for your LUC 6 land, and if it's approved, then you can use that permit with your application, you'll get an exemption. So I am going to speak briefly about the transitional exemption for qualifying forestry investments because this has changed since the first reading. The applicant, in order to benefit from this exemption, must now have had a clear interest, this is the defined term in the legislation, in the land at the prior to the 4th of December 2024, I think the date is worth double checking that, where a clear interest has also a very specific definition. A clear interest is either ownership, a registered lease or forestry right, or an agreement to obtain one of those things, a conditional or unconditional sale and purchase agreement for the land, or a written offer to purchase the land, and there's some additional requirements around the status of that offer and the response from the seller and other things. So before, if an investment could qualify if you had a lease or a sale and purchase agreement or a ruling or a resource consent or a permit, or basically a clear commercial interest or one of these several other things. You now have to have had a clear interest as well as one of these other things, most of which would probably have required you to have a clear interest anyway. The point here is that if you viewed the first summary of the transitional investment exemption and thought that you were fine, it would be worth giving it another careful read to make sure that that's still the case with the variations to the drafting. Applications received prior to 31st of October, pretty much what it says on the tin. If you submit an application for registration to MPI and it's submitted as opposed to just drafted like it's properly received by them before the 31st of October, then this legislation does not apply to that application. And then where we're going to spend most of the next 20 minutes or so is on these, basically the LUC specific exemptions and allowances. So while LUCs come in these 8 different flavors with a bunch of various different sub-flavors, as far as this legislation is concerned, you can bundle a whole bunch of them together. So LUC 1 to 5 are equivalent under the legislation. LUC 6 is also generally part of 1 to 5, except that it has this special provision for registration through a ballot process, or rather a permit for registration, a permit for an exemption through the ballot process. And then LUC 7 or 8 are functionally equivalent as far as the restrictions are concerned. And when you look at those, you'll see that they interlock with the exemptions. So we've got the new exotic forest restrictions are specific to LUC 1 to 6 land. And then we also have a 25% allowance for 1 to 6 land and a permit process for LUC 6 land. So this stuff over here, it's restricted, but you can apply for ballot. All of this stuff up here, it's restricted, but the area contributes to your allowance. And then everything in LUC 7 and 8, it's unrestricted, but that's only a good thing if you wanted to plant the forest there. If you wanted to plant the forest somewhere else, it actually could be a bad thing because it doesn't contribute to your 25% allowance. And right. And then there's also this high erosion stuff, which is sort of somewhere in the mix. It's another path to effectively unrestriction, which we'll be spending more time trying to find out the details of. So a question that you have to figure out for your future ETS registration applications, and which also means for your future forest planting and planning, given that you probably care about ETS registration, is which LUC classifications should you use and when do you need to decide how to use them? And the reason I say which is that there are 2 options available. You can either use the region level or national level mappings, which are basically fairly coarse mappings that are available nationally, or you can choose to acquire and use a farm level LUC mapping, which is much higher resolution and will much better capture the specifics of your farm, which interestingly will not necessarily be a good thing for you, depending on where you plan to plant and what you plan to plant and what your situation was under the 2 different maps. So you do have to choose one as soon as you start to do anything that relies on the LUC status or exemptions. And you need to do this at the latest when you make the first application that depends on an LUC category for a given title. It's also tricky because it doesn't necessarily require you to be planting on that title. How that title is treated in terms of an individual farm, which is an aggregation of several titles potentially that are adjacent and under the same ownership, could mean that even though you're not planting on an area, it sort of gets pulled in and you have to make a choice on the mapping. Once you've chosen, basically you can't change. There's no using the regional map for one application and then the farm level map for another application and then the regional map again on a different title and mixing and matching. You have to pick one and stick with it. And this one here is really complicated, is that the 25% exemption can only be used effectively by one owner, and it has implications beyond the title because of the way it's calculated against an individual farm. So how to choose? Firstly, consider if and where you might want to establish exotic forest now and into the future. Assess that against the New Zealand Land Resources Institute map, like national level LUC, and also assess it against the property scale map if you have one. If you don't have one, you need to decide whether it might be worth your time to get one. And I'm saying all of this as though you should just be able to figure this out. I realize all of these decisions are hard. That's part of what we're building and tooling to help with, which I'll share a little on later. Sorry, I'm repeating myself here. Now choose an option per title, some caveats on the extent to which you can do it per title, but pick based on what best suits your plans given the constraints that exist, essentially. As I said, do this before your first registration on the individual farm, which includes that title. And remember that the region level erosion maps may also give you another path to like unrestriction, essentially, and they're independent of the farm level LUC versus the region level LUC maps. And I'll show how that could work in a moment. So in the words of Maximus Decimus Meridius, the ETS LUC choice you make echoes in eternity, which sounded hilarious when we were talking about it internally, but it's very hard to tell jokes to a silent webinar. So hopefully at least one person laughed. Region level or farm level maps. We thought it'd be useful to just provide a single scenario of how much these can vary and how much the implications can vary. Obviously, this is one farm out of tens of thousands. The implications here may be totally different for other farms in other areas, but it just shows that it's something you should think about. On the left is a region level map for this farm, and for reference, the farm is on the order of, we'll see the numbers shortly, but it's around about 1,000 hectares, so it's a pretty big area. You can see that the stuff around the sort of river valley tends to be, for the most part, lower LUC, which means better, more farmable land, and then there's a whole heap of LUC6 sort of scattered through the hills. Contrast this with the farm level mapping on the right, quite different. Like there is a lot of rhyming between the two. Like there's sort of the stuff up in the northwest corner, which both maps agree is LUC7. A lot of the stuff along near the river, both maps agree is LUC sort of 1 to 5. But the farm level map identifies some new LUC7 land sort of through the hills, and a lot of new LUC 1 to 5 land through the hills, which used to be called LUC6. And here are the implications of that for these different allocations and categories. So at the region scale, the level of LUC 1 to 5 land was significantly lower. There's a lot more LUC 1 to 5 in the farm scale mapping, which if you're thinking of this as an opportunity for your, like how productive your farm is going to be, it's probably really good news. Not so necessarily for your ETS entitlements and allocations. The LUC6 area has dropped enormously in the farm scale mapping, and the LUC 7 to 8 has gone up. So of your 25% allocation for this farm, it's actually reduced through the farm scale mapping. And the amount of your land and I've got that wrong, it's reduced much more. What an amateur. Oh no, sorry, that's correct. So this is the amount of your 25%. So it's 25% of the sum of LUC 1 to 6. So you've actually got less 25% allocation than you had at the region scale with the farm scale. Also, the amount of LUC6 land that you could potentially plant under the ballot has massively reduced. And the unrestricted land, though, has gone up significantly. Whether or not that is beneficial for you depends entirely on what forest you might want to plant where in exotic trees. There's also a further complication, which is the erosion classification question. As I mentioned before, any land which is designated as high or severe erosion risk in the regional map is unrestricted forest. There may be other reasons that you can't plant it due to regional constraints, but you can see that here I've got these red blobs are areas that are in the highly erodible land layer, designated as having a high landslide risk with delivery to a stream. That's not to say that these necessarily will be high or severe erosion risk in the regional level mapping, but there's a pretty good chance. And you can see that they actually coincide with a lot of the areas where you might gain benefits from the farm level LUC 7 and 8 classifications. So the interaction of these is going to be a further factor in which one you choose and where you can plant trees and what you can do with the trees that you plant there. On the 25% topic, just reiterating what I said last time and have already, I think, in this session, but it's important to remember there's lots of fish hooks here. You can make more than one application under the 25% allowance, unless since the first application in respect of an individual farm, the ownership or the record or records of title have changed, or the farm boundary has changed. And we are not happy about this constraint. I don't think it's driven by the objectives of the policy at all. It's not consistent with the goal. The goal is to provide farmers a certain amount of flexibility and the ability to change, plan for their farm and still incorporate forestry to a certain degree. This is a massive obstacle, especially considering sort of future sale of the farm and succession planning and this kind of thing. And it seems to have been put in place due to perceived technical limitations. We think that there is a workaround for these limitations that could better achieve the goals of the policy And we hope to see this amended in the future, but I wouldn't anticipate it being amended in the next year or so because this is new legislation. I think there's going to be some time given for it to sort of settle and shake out. I would treat this constraint as being very real in the short term for planning, but we do want to see it change. There's another part of the legislation which I honestly still don't know exactly how it works, and we're seeking clarification on this. So basically, how does your allocation change on transfer of ownership? There's a specific clause. If the landowner of an individual farm becomes the landowner of LUC class 1 to 6 land adjacent to the individual farm, the 25% allowance for the individual farm does not increase. I don't know if this means that individual farms are fixed at commencement. If you buy a neighbouring individual farm, do they remain two distinct individual farms? Does it only matter if you haven't yet? Like, multiple questions here, which I am hoping we will see clarification of as we go through definition of the regulations. What I said last time remains. We think that the 25% entitlement is going to be by far the most accessible and lowest risk pathway to restricted forest registrations for most farmers for new investments. If you can access one of the other exemptions, then you certainly should try to. It's very much to your benefit. Either way, you need to plan ahead. And I will briefly mention the LUC 6 permitting process again. I think there's still a lot of questions here, at least around considerations like the timing and the cost, but in broad strokes, there's a 15,000 per hectare per year limit. This can be amended through, I forget the exact mechanism, but it can be adjusted annually, but this is the default. The permits are issued annually. You can and should apply ahead of planting, in our view, or ahead of even committing to plant. You don't need to own the land to apply, but you do need the consent of the landowner. And it's likely, in our view, that there is some sort of fee for application, whether that's at the time of the application or at the time of the grant of the permit. We don't know. There is also now mention in the legislation of 2 ballots. It's not clear to me how those will function and whether there's actually an expectation of 2 distinct points per year where there will be a ballot, or just an allowance for it, or if it's just a legislative mechanism to accommodate the there's a special process whereby smaller areas get a certain part of the ballot allotted to them in particular, distinct from larger areas. And I don't know if it's just a way to sort of achieve that within the legislation. But basically, we're going to have to give a further update, I think, later this year once some more clarity exists around the permitting process, because there's still a whole lot of unanswered questions, which means that in terms of your next year's planting, right now, I can guarantee nobody has a permit because they haven't had the first ballot. That'll remain the case, I expect, at the end of this year, because I think the first ballot will be next year, which is going to have implications for your sourcing and commitments to nurseries for any planting that you want to do next year. You're going to, if you really want to plant next year, look to one of the other pathways, is my recommendation. As for the permits themselves, they're randomly allocated to ballot applicants. As I mentioned, there's a ring-fenced allocation for small applications. I'm not sure if it's actually defined what the size small is. It may be something that's also able to be configured. They're non-transferable. They're valid for support of an application for 3 full years after issuance, and there are some allowances for extension of that on request in the case of circumstances beyond your control that prevented you using it within that period. A key constraint is that you can't, I didn't phrase this very well, and it's paraphrasing the legislation, but you cannot apply for a new permit for a given title if you already have a permit for that title. So you basically have to use up a permit, and then you're eligible to apply for a ballot allocation for a new one. Another limitation is that any given permit, you can only use it to support one application for registration once. So if you have a 300 hectare permit, and you want to plant 100 hectares in 2026 and 100 hectares in 2027 and 100 hectares in 2028, you have to delay your registration until 2028 and then use it all at once. Otherwise, you use it and the rest of your unused allocation expires and you have to go and apply for another permit. So this means that there is a pathway to sort of multi-year staged planting programs, but you're going to have to be extremely careful with the timing and make sure your permit doesn't lapse before you finally get the registration in. In a nutshell, as I said again last time, the big picture hasn't changed. If you're going to pursue any of this, and there are still it's still extremely attractive. There are many good reasons to plant forest. It's not like the option's off the table. The key point is you really have to make a plan, figure out the pathways that exist and how you would like to pursue them, get some independent advice. We can help with this. And what you do now has implications for later on into the long term, and it could have quite a significant impact on the value of your farm if you've got a hill country farm and you're considering carbon revenue streams as an opportunity. Something to help get this started, which is new today. It just went live about an hour ago. We are providing a free region level LUC analysis per farm. Basically, knowing your regional LUC breakdown, in our view, gives you a foundation for planning. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily what you're going to use for your future registration, but at least it's what you could use. You've got some confidence in the absence of potentially a farm level LUC mapping if you don't have one. So we're making this available to all landowners for free. Those of you who've used our platform in the past for ETS assessment requests will be quite familiar with the interface. Basically, go into our platform, the link will be below in a second, find your farm, click submit, and then this won't come immediately because we're still finalizing the report content, but you're going to get emailed a report in the next few weeks that does this first breakdown for you of what the distribution of LUC classes is across your farm, what that means in terms of pretty similar to what I shared before for that specific farm, what your 25% is, what your LUC6 is, what your LUC7 and 8 are, where they'd be, and what the implications are in terms of eligibility. I'll leave this here for a second so that you can look at it, but basically if you go to our website and click landowners, then there's a LUC assessment link there, or just go to carboncrop.com/ETS-LUC-assessment, and that'll get you started. After you've done that, or regardless of whether you do or don't do that, there's a whole heap of other questions that you're likely to be asking to work through this process, like what is my restricted versus unrestricted unforested area, because the forested part you don't have to worry about. What are my options for forest or silver pasture in my less productive areas? How much of my existing forest is ETS eligible? How does the allowance vary between the regional level and the farm level LUC? How can I plan out all of my future planting over multiple years considering all of this? These features and more either exist or are coming in the CarbonCrop platform. You may well be able to access the CarbonCrop platform through your catchment group. So if you can't, then a great first step is to express your interest to your catchment group in doing so, because they generally want to help you out. There is also an opportunity to do that at that same URL. Just go down the bottom and find the express your interest button. All right, that actually took less time than I thought, but I'm sure you guys are all glad that it didn't take more time. I'll now jump into the Q&A, and we've got one live question there, but let me just, with a precursor, a number of the longer questions were a bit cut off. Sorry, that's our fault. We're using a new Q&A system. If we don't show your question below or we didn't get your full question, please email us at hello@carboncrop.com or just ask at the net webinar. So I will start with the live question as a prize for whoever it was who turned up in person. The question is, so for LUC6, is the ballot on top of the 25% allowance, or do you only opt for the ballot if you want to plant LUC6 and exotics beyond the 25% allowance? Really great question. So it is on top of the 25% allowance, which is to say that if you, somebody just found that they couldn't get the LUC assessment link. I'll just show the link address again. So carboncrop.com/ETS-LUC assessment. I will just double check that I've actually given you guys the right link. Bear with me 1 second. I don't want to send you all to the wrong place. Yeah, it seems to be the link. So ETS-LUC-assessment. We'll post this online somewhere so that you can click through as well, rather than having to read a website or listen to me. Read it out. So sorry, back to the LUC6 question. The ballot allocation is on top of the 25%, meaning that if you apply for an LUC6 permit through the ballot and then use it, it doesn't reduce the amount of planting that you can do on LUC6 1 to 6 land. You've still got your full 25%. Similarly, if you used up your whole 25% and there was still a bunch of LUC6 land that you wanted to, that was unforested and you wanted to register it, you would still be able to apply for a ballot allocation. The And then the second part of that is, would you only opt for the ballot if you want to plant LUC6 and exotics beyond the 25% allowance? I wouldn't necessarily say that that's the only reason to go for the ballot. I think it depends on the ballot terms, but I would say that if you can get the ballot allocation and use that instead of using up your 25%, it's a great way of preserving your options. It has very different implications in terms of transfer of ownership and succession planning and the ability for certain allocations to expire. So if you're looking at planting only LUC1, LUC6 land, the 25% is a great backup if you don't get through the ballot, but I would try for a ballot allocation if it was me. All right, another question. Has the new legislation provided any further path to higher value for native plantings, or is it still largely referencing the old lookup tables? Great question again, and I think we do have one like that in the pre-submitted question, so I'll try not to replicate it. But this legislation doesn't make any changes at all to the yields for different classes of forest under either the participant-specific tables or the default tables. So native plantings under the default tables, they're the same as they have been before. It does have some interesting implications for the opportunity costs of native forest, because previously native forest almost had to compete across all land classes with exotic forest. Now it might be easier to make a commercial case for native plantings on LUC 1 to 6 because there is a limit to how much of it you could put into exotics. And this is going to have interesting implications on the business dynamics, which I think we'll sort of see unfold over the year to come. But yes, there are no changes to the actual table yields at the moment. So another great question, when does a farm become a forest? If a property is predominantly a forest, are there restrictions on planting the farmland areas? So in a nutshell, yes. The legislation doesn't make any distinction except as relates to unfarmed land, which I mentioned before. And yeah, I won't repeat myself in detail, but basically be very careful that if you think you're unfarmed land, then you really are unfarmed land. If you're talking about your farmland areas, you can basically guarantee that this legislation will apply to those areas unless they meet one of the other definitions for non-restriction or exemption. But other than that, it becomes a forest when you plant a forest on it and you try to get that forest registered in the ETS. Will the government look to improve the accuracy of the LUC classifications? The scale can give some interesting results. Like, yep, that's an understatement. As we saw before, the region level classifications can vary dramatically farm by farm. It's not always consistent with how you might view your farm or how your farm might be. I don't know of any plans at the moment to meaningfully amend the national level LRI mappings, but it may well happen. I could certainly see an argument, like if it was free to have the national level mappings be full resolution and equivalent to the farm level mappings, I can see why the various regulators, it would make sense to do that, but I'm not aware of anything that will achieve that in the short term. I think we've just answered this. Oh, no, it's not quite the same. So is there any change being worked on or announced that will better recognise the carbon sequestered in native plantings? There has been, so this is publicly available under the Max Carbon program. There is mention of work that may be undertaken around the Indigenous lookup tables, and there was also a response to a consultation recently that mentioned Indigenous lookup tables might be reviewed in the coming year or so. There are no further public details than that I'm aware of. This was a more direct, simple question. A small area of forest, 4 to 5 hectares in exotics alongside scattered native as a carbon sink. Yeah, short answer, worth a look. I'd say if you're interested in registering it, get in touch with us. A bit off this topic, thoughts on what would happen to the carbon price if we pulled out of Paris? Like, it's a pretty big question. I think that if we just pulled out of Paris with no preamble at all, well, firstly, I don't think that would happen, but I imagine that would be extremely negative for the carbon price. More broadly, though, if we were to pull out of Paris and the implication was that the Zero Carbon Act was basically going to be crippled or repealed, and we no longer had any intention of limiting carbon emissions or trying to reduce emissions or trying to price emissions to achieve that, I think it's almost tautological that the carbon price would collapse. this would require a lot of changes to legislation beyond just us no longer being in the Paris Agreement. Worth noting that one of our biggest gaps in the Paris Agreement is actually methane, which currently isn't part of the ETS and doesn't really affect the carbon price that much. But yeah, it would be certainly influential for the carbon price. I think it's safe to say if we pulled out of Paris. There's also a whole heap of biochar questions that came in. We are not biochar experts. Biochar projects aren't currently eligible for the ETS, but just briefly to extend on this, quite a few of the questions that we had in this vein were around what are the implications of this new legislation as relates to other projects around waste to energy or biochar or similar. And the answer is there are potentially implications, but only in as much as those projects were relying on registering the forest for the time that it was standing as forest in the ETS, which could very much be the case if you're doing some sort of biofuel project and it requires creating a forest feedstock. The carbon from the first stand of that forest is going to be pretty valuable in terms of kind of providing some early stage cash flow. So if you were relying on planting that forest on LUC 1 to 6 land, it could have big implications. It's not going to change the amount of carbon credits that you get for your biochar project, for the biochar component, because those biochar, the activity isn't currently recognised by the ETS at all, and certainly not by the ETS for forestry. And then there was one question, as pasture is 30 times more efficient at sequestering carbon, why can't New Zealand farmers claim carbon credits? I've kept this in verbatim. I'm not sure of the basis for that claim. It's certainly not consistent with the numbers that I've seen around pasture carbon sequestration. Soil can be quite an efficient carbon store. It's also quite a volatile carbon store. There's very high risk of soil carbon reversal in drought and other events. And the reason New Zealand farmers can't claim carbon credits, even to the extent that pasture and soil do sequester carbon, is that they're not currently part of the ETS. There may be mechanisms for soil carbon recognition under voluntary schemes. We are not very active in this space, mostly because of our concerns around durability of sequestration and the extreme difficulty of quantifying soil carbon. That said, though, I think that soil carbon is fantastic. Increasing soil organic carbon is a really good thing for multiple different reasons, and I support anybody who's working on it. I think it's important and a good idea, and it would be nice to see it eventually recognised in the ETS or with some sort of incentive mechanism. That's us done for the day. Thanks, as always, for your interest and your attention. Please take the time, if you think that there might be people interested in who this is going to have an impact on, to share around the link to that free assessment tool. Obviously, we are hoping that people will find this interesting enough that they continue with CarbonCrop and use more of it, but we really do think it's also going to be quite valuable and impactful just as a free thing, even if you don't do anything else with us at any point. So yeah, many thanks and enjoy the rest of your day. Oh, wait, did I miss any questions? No, I'm good. Oh, sorry, yeah. Farm level assessments, sorry. Scrutinized in terms of methodology and layers used as slope. Yes, you have to undertake the farm level LUC assessment in accordance with the specified methodology. So LUC already matters for various purposes. You have to be able to state that the assessment that you have was prepared in a form consistent with that. So those extras for everybody who didn't drop off straight away. Thanks a lot.